Welcome to session number 86 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, we're going to be focusing on one book by Tad Williams, To Green Angel Tower. You can see it is a massive tome. This is the third book in the trilogy that is called Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which for a long time was just a standalone trilogy, and now in the present is the third book in an entire series since Williams came back to the world of Osten-Ard later on. We're not going to worry too much about that at this point, although maybe in a future session we'll start looking at some of those other works. This is a lengthy book. It's the edition that I have, over 1,000 pages, and as the third book of the trilogy, everything is kind of coming to a head. There's additional revelations. So we did the first two books, which was, over 1,100 pages of material last session. And now we're going to finish up with the series in this session. Now, if you're new to this series, I want to tell you a little bit about what Worlds of Speculative Fiction is. So this is a usually monthly series, which we do now over YouTube live and streaming and things like that. In the past, it began in 2016, so we've been going for quite a long time as an in-person series hosted by the Brookfield Public Library. You can find all of the previous session recordings in the playlist, as well as on the page that's linked to below in the video description. And we do this every month, and so worlds means that we're particularly interested in world building, and usually in looking at a consistent narrative universe that spans multiple novels, novellas, short stories. Occasionally we'll do one if it is a really, really long work that's a standalone book, but typically we're looking at what an author is doing across an entire series, developing a narrative world. So we look at the world building, the world revelation that is going on, and we also attend to some philosophical themes. Sometimes these are metaphysical, sometimes they have to do more with ethics or character development or all sorts of other matters, but there's usually some really interesting philosophical depth, and that is definitely the case with this particular series, and I would say even more in this particular book than in the two predecessors in the trilogy, which not a big surprise. So what we're going to do in this session is obviously talk a lot about what goes on in this book, what more we learn about the world. We already covered a lot of world building in the previous session. We'll do a bit more biography than we did in the first session of Tad Williams, his life, why he wrote these books, the sort of responses to them. And we'll talk a lot about important themes, particularly philosophical themes that are either articulated directly in the work, put in the mouths of characters or their interactions, or which are raised by the work itself. So we got a little while of indulging ourselves in this, anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes for these sessions. I never actually know until I start shooting how much we'll do, so buckle in, and if you're watching this during the premiere, you can participate in live chat with me because I will be there joining you for it answering questions and responding to comments. If you're watching this afterwards, feel free to leave comments about things that you find particularly interesting about Tad Williams, the stories themselves, the characters, the narrative, the universe, or the philosophical themes, and we can continue the conversation that way. So let's get started. Before we talk about the world building involved in this narrative universe of Osten Ard and go into some of the philosophical themes, which are going to be the bulk of this session, I do have to discharge one obligation that I incurred in the earlier session devoted to the first two books of this trilogy, which is to give a more full biography, although not a completely full one, of Tad Williams. So he's born in 1957, as we talked about last time, and he's going to more or less remain in, the same area, very broadly speaking. He's born in San Jose. He's going to stay around Palo Alto, where, you've got a lot of different things going on. Interestingly, although Stanford is there, Williams is not going to go to college like many of his friends from high school. Instead, he's going to pursue a lot of different jobs. I can kind of relate to that as somebody who chose to go to college for a similar line of reasoning that he'll talk about a little bit later on. But we should mention that while he is a student, he's already reading a lot. He's already beginning to do some writing. Many of us as kids, we were invited to do some story writing, some narrative within our middle school, perhaps even elementary school and then high school classes. And he is an overachiever in that respect. He writes some swords and sorcery stuff longer than the assignment requires, does some drawings to accompany it. And so I could totally relate to that myself, although he's almost of a different generation, right? Being born in 57. And he mentions that his mother was an important influence on him and his brothers in childhood in promoting creativity, working on costumes, coming up with songs. So he had a good, we could say, matrix from which to emerge. And he definitely is a creative person, but he decides that what matters to him is less going off to college and more living on his own, being independent, earning his own way. So he does a whole bunch of jobs, many of which he says in interviews were kind of sucky in certain respects. And, these include a number of, let's say, uncreative jobs, which, some of them would be delivering newspapers. If you've ever had a paper route, you know what that's like. Making tacos, stacking tiles, selling shoes, selling insurance. He was involved in a financial institution, which, according to him, involved a lot of servicing and collecting loans. He also drew military manuals, did some writing stuff. He was now we also have some arguably creative work that he's doing. So he talks about being in a rock band that actually did some funny stuff. He also recounts instances of pretending to be a different band, playing a set, and then coming on stage with his band as the actual band, whose name was Idiot. And I guess it was a pretty eclectic mix of music. He hosted a college radio talk show. He did some acting work. He did some writing for theater works. He created a television pilot and concept called Valley Vision. He was also a tech writer for the Apple Corporation and did some multimedia work as a contractor for them as well. And so, it wasn't all drudgery jobs, but he wanted to do creative writing work as a way to sort of get himself out of this cycle of taking one job after another. So, in his time that he had available, he would work on his craft and does a number of, different writing projects. Eventually gets picked up by Daw Books, for one of his early stories. And then, we're going to see that this trilogy is really the first massive major work that he's going to bring out. So we should talk about the chronology of this trilogy. Interestingly, to Green Angel Tower, which we have available as one massive, nearly 1,100 word or 1,100 page tome, I don't know how many words are actually in this, was released in 2 volumes. So kind of a tetralogy, but actually officially a trilogy. And Williams says, I write to the length that the works require. So we see that the Osten-Ard books, there's really like 2 sets of them. We have these that are coming out in the late 80s to early 90s, right? We have the Dragonbone Chair in 88, we have the Stone of Farewell in 1990, and then we have To Green Angel Tower coming out in 1993. A significant gap between those, but it's a much longer story. And now recently, very cool development, he has returned to the world of Osten-Ard, and we have kind of a story that's still developing, and perhaps we might see more stuff down the line. So in 2017, a novella, Heart of What Was Lost. Then in 2017 as well, The Witchwood Crown, a new novel. Empire of Grass in 2019, Into the Narrow Dark in 2022, and this very year we saw Navigator's Children come out. So a tetralogy, and there's also another work that is not yet released, but he's working on a prequel called The Splintered Sun. So big, massive return to the world of Osten-Ard, coming later after, except for the prequel, of course, after these stories, but nonetheless set within the same narrative universe. So, and each of these is a pretty massive book as well. He's also got a number of other series, the Otherland series, which is sci-fi, Shadow March series, fantasy, Ordinary Farm, which is fantasy but considered young adult, and then finally Bobby Dollar, which falls into the class of urban fantasy, sort of a more subgenre there. And the other things to say about him is he's married to Deborah Biel, and they have some children, many, many pets. He's, I believe, 67 right now, and so still working, very actively. You could say that for somebody of his writing capacities, this might actually be the best time for him, So we might see some other really interesting novels coming out. He's been very heavily engaged with his fans. He started a Tad Williams message board back in 2001 and continues to give interviews. And we're going to turn to those next just to get some insights about his own process, his views on his work, the people that have influenced him, and what other interesting things he has to say about the world of Osten-Ard. Last session, when we focused on the first 2 books of this trilogy, we didn't look at any interviews with Tad Williams, but I thought this could be kind of helpful. We usually do a bit of that in most of these sessions, and viewers say they find them helpful. So I've gone through a number of interviews with Williams and culled out some excerpts from them that I think might be helpful in both promoting discussion that we'll have and in, thinking about the nature of these works. So we'll start with the Treacherous Paths interview, and we're going to be looking at the issue of influence. So they say, you've cited several authors, specifically Tolkien, Zelazny, Peake, Moorcock, Baum, and many others, as well as world mythology and history as being influences on your writing. What other sources, such as film, television, or radio, have influenced the writing of your Ost and Ard books? And Williams says, well, that's hard to say because so many of my written influences began early, and I only remember them all because I still have the books. The Addams Family, New Yorker cartoons, and then the television show definitely had an effect on my lifestyle, if not my writing. Get Smart, as a reflection of the spy genre, probably activated some of my absurdist tendencies, as did Monty Python and other English comedy later. I also admired the early Universal monster movies, and I was scared to death by Godzilla when I was super young. And then, of course, we read more about his literary influences in the Flames Rising interview. He's asked, who are his influences? And he says, well, I grew up on lots of great science fiction and fantasy writers. So he mentions Tolkien, Bradbury, Sturgeon, Ellison, Zelazny, Moorcock, Leiber, Le Guin, Dick, just to name a very few. But I've also been influenced by great historical writers like Barbara Tuchman and J.J. Norwich, as well as science writers like Stephen Jay Gould. Also, many mainstream or literary novelists like Pynchon and Updike and Thomas Berger. Again, just to name a few, and artistic genre writers like Ruth Rendell have changed and charged my ambition. So you see he's got quite a wide range of influences. He's also got, in the Flames Rising interview, very interesting question being raised here. Well, what actually prompted you to become a science fiction and fantasy author? Now, instead of saying, well, I wanted to follow in the footsteps of all these people, he says two reasons, really. I liked the freedom of the genre, that you could do almost anything you wanted as long as you delivered a story. And it was also something I'd read a lot, though by no means exclusively, when I was younger, so I thought I could judge whether I was doing a good job, at least in the beginning. Now, notice so competence and freedom as two motifs that go together and really, I would say, kind of reinforce each other. You have more freedom the more that you actually understand and know. And if we think about some of the authors who he's mentioned, particularly, Zelazny, Moorcock, Le Guin, Philip K. Dick earlier on. So he is, growing up at a time when the new wave of science fiction, which includes a lot of fantasy, would be something he's encountering in his formative years. Now, switching to talking about his own influence, not the influence on him, but by him, in Treacherous Paths, they say a number of fantasy authors have cited you as an influence on their works. Did you ever think when you were writing Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, you would influence the next generation of writers? Now, you'd expect him to say, oh no, what a happy circumstance. And Williams says, well, I wanted to, yes. That was why there was a metafictional layer of criticism in it about the current state of epic fantasy and a reflection on some differences between me, Tolkien lover, but not, I hope, Tolkien imitator, and a lot of other work going on at the time. But then nobody seemed to notice that part, treating it as if it was just another better than some Tolkien-esque big fantasy. Apparently some did notice, they just didn't write about it in the reviews. So I'm pleased that in some ways it was influential because I was a bit despairing at the time. To be frank, I wanted to write what Game of Thrones became the next milestone in epic fantasy. Apparently it was closer to that than I knew, if still nowhere near as well known as George's epic. Then we read in Fantasy Book Critic interview, going back to that same question, George R. R. Martin once acknowledged the debt he owed to your Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy, which got him started on arguably the biggest, strongest contender for the most intriguing fantasy series, the Song of Ice and Fire. How do you view your books as being the genesis for George's magnum opus, and also on this reference? So he says, well, I love George's writing. I'm nothing but honored to be associated with his work, and I'd love to write something with him someday. That's a very interesting response there, isn't it? Now, switching to coming back actually to this, like challenging the narrative structure and thinking about genre, Portalist Interview says, your work lives primarily in the realms of fantasy and science fiction, but you've utilized elements from horror, noir, and beyond in your writing. Is there a genre you're eager to weave in next? Or perhaps a dream project you're hoping to explore? And so William says this, I often tell young or beginning writers, and this is very good advice, you need to read outside of genre, particularly if they want to write genre fiction. Otherwise, if you only read in the genre you're writing, you have an ever-narrowing circle of influence that quickly becomes incestuous. Plus, a big part of developing an authorial voice is what you bring to the party. So the more broadly you read and the wider your array of resources and influences, the more individual your writer's voice is going to be. I have a few non-science science fiction fantasy types of stories I'd like to write, including a novel about the time and place I grew up in, but I always have to balance it with the need to make a living. Late capitalism can be a cruel taskmaster, but I will also bring in all the things that move me to all my work, from science and history to comedy, and stylistically from Dickens and Jane Austen to Hunter S. Thompson. As writers, here's a great line, we are what we eat. Isn't that a great way of phrasing this importance of reading outside of your genre? Fantasy book critic asks him, as a fantasy author, do you feel compelled to follow the tropes and stereotypes that are prevalent in traditional fantasy? And he says, no. There are some tropes that are so old and venerable, the mythic archetypes, if you will, that you have to at least honor them. That means you have to acknowledge them in some way. They can't be ignored, but they do not have to be repeated mindlessly either. If you make a point of a character being the subject of a prophecy, something has to happen with that prophecy. It must have significance. So, for example, in these books, the prophecy of the three swords, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, right? It doesn't have to be true or even crucial to the eventual ending of the story, but neither can its existence be brushed away. A little bit changing topic here, talking about actual world building. The Scouts interview says, how do you write? Are you a well-structured planner, a creative chaotic, or a member of gang writers? He says, well, I'm a planner, an architect. I generally work alone because I like to move plots and characters around like chess pieces until I find the right balance between drama and naturalism. I keep it all in my head as I'm working because it's more flexible that way. I can try a dozen different possibilities in my thoughts and never have to rewrite a thing after I decide what works best. My ideas stay in my head a long time before they turn into stories, and often accrue bits of other ideas along the way. Then, when I start to see it all fit together, I begin world building, creating geography and history that will complement the story. When they follow up with another question, okay, so what part does the pure writing have in an author's job, and what are the other parts? So Williams says this, I like to spend thinking time separate from actual writing time every day. I've found over the years I'm more productive if I think first without the impatient tapping finger of a blank page or blank screen. Then, when I've made sense of what I want to do, I actually sit down at the keyboard. But I do a lot of world building too. So part of that thinking time every day is also me ranging far afield to make sure the ideas I'm working with are supported by the world of that story. And if I'm not sure, I spend time thinking about what I don't know about the world in which the story happens. World building does not end with the beginning of the writing of the book, far from it. So that's a very interesting set of observations, giving us a sense of how world building, there's a dynamic, right, a dialectic between the world building and thinking about the world and then the actual writing on his part. Now, we find a couple other interesting things coming up. For example, in the Portalist interview, they're talking about the last novel in your Last King of Osten-Ard series comes out next year, so this is just a year ago. How does bringing this saga to an end compare to taking things back with a prequel, as you did twice with your Osten-Ard books? And so William says, okay, well, what's most interesting about this project is it's turned my best-known work, at least in America, the original Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books, into a full-scale world and history that now exists as more than just one story. I've had to fill in so many details of the world that I'm now going to want to keep playing in this sandbox just to justify all the work I've put in. But world building is perhaps my favorite part of this whole fictive exercise, so I'm not complaining. And while this book will definitely have an ending that I think will satisfy readers, Osten-Ard remains an ongoing story with its history and many of its characters intact. So I won't have to feel so much like I'm restarting if I write more stuff set there in parentheses, which I almost certainly will. Then we get a really interesting observation in the Fantasy Book Critic interview. So they say many people often equate the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy as your debut books, even though you published Tail Chaser's Song first. What is it about the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn books, in your opinion, that your fans love so much? Now, he's talked about world building. Notice what he's going to say here. I tried to write a story that was about those kinds of stories, but also stood up by itself. So we get the meta-fantasy trope stuff there, right? But notice this. Also, I think people find my characters sympathetic. I can't tell you how many Binabics and such I run into on the internet. Most of all, though, I think people can sense I don't just read fantasy books, that I bring a wealth of other kinds of material to my stories, which gives them a certain depth and resonance. So world building is really massively important. Storytelling, plot as well, but characters are essential too, right? And it's very interesting. It reminds me of Aristotle's remarks about the elements of tragedy, where muthos, story, is the primary thing, but character and thought, and then lexis, we translate as style or dialogue, are second, third, and fourth in importance as well and need to be brought in. So moving on, we have some interesting discussions about the length of these massive, gigantic novels. And I think that really does apply to this particular work. Mom's Basement asks, you're mostly known for long works of fiction, even your standalone novel. War of the Flowers was a big book. Why do you think your writing lends itself to the long form? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? Is it in any way influenced by your audience and the expectations of your readers? So Williams says, I can't say that I set out to write a particular size of book. It's just that some ideas are obviously longer and more complicated than others. I just want to tell the story at the length that seems right. So my readers will obviously tolerate, and some may actually prefer big books, but that's more the result of my approach. I found readers like that rather than any attempt on my part to write any particular sort of thing. And then we get this interesting discussion going on in the Sci-Fi Site interview. And so, it reads, Williams' Otherland books weigh in at a hefty 1,000 plus pages per volume, and there's 4 volumes in the series. Each one has a straining girth as Williams' ample imagination fills them to bursting point. But does size really matter? Now, that's about Otherland, a different series than this, but I think it applies equally to the Osten-Ard books. So Williams says, I think rather than does size matter, this one is closer to how long is a piece of string. A good book is a good book, whether it's a tendon-busting megatome or a slim volume. Obviously, the reverse is true as well, and more often, since, as Theodore Sturgeon's law so amply puts it, 90% of everything is crap. Because of this law, when critics and reviewers take a shortcut and assume a big fantasy book is badly written hackwork, they're usually right. But they'd be almost as likely to be correct if they made that guess about, say, every technophilic hard sci-fi novel or every trendy splatterpunk novel or just about anything else in the genre you could name. The fact is, you have to read the damn things or you have no right to comment on them. I've had people talk absolute rubbish about books of mine and only reveal afterwards that they hadn't even read them because they already, quote, knew what kind of books they were. Books like mine are different from standard novels, but not because of size so much as because they're several consecutive volumes that comprise one story. That means I'm forced to commit to things very early in the story that will actually be published and thus darn hard to edit long before I'm actually writing the ending. Also, with really long books, you have to work very consciously to keep the reader involved in the short term. It's kind of like the Alcoholics Anonymous thing where you don't quit drinking for the rest of your life. You just say, you're not going to drink today, and then you have to keep stringing the days together. From my own personal point of view, the only thing unusual about writing such long stories is that you know you're going to be doing them for a long time, and sometimes that can be a little daunting. You don't get the free and frolicsome stage of planning a book, which is a bit like a new romance, for very long compared to the length of the overall process. So it takes a certain amount of stick-to-itiveness. It definitely feels like a marathon sometimes. So I think those are some really interesting insights into who this author is and his process and how he thinks about his own role as an author, connected to other authors, but also why it is that his stories end up being so compelling. The world building that Tad Williams carried out in the first two books of this trilogy, The Dragonbone Chair and The Stone of Farewell, the latter of which, by the way, is describing or naming a really important site in this where a significant part of the action in the very first part of the much more massive to Green Angel Tower is taking place. The Stone of Farewell is actually a sort of mini mountain, you could say, surrounded by water, which turns into a frozen lake around it. So the world building that's really well developed here is going to get some additional developments into Green Angel Tower. You could say that Williams has done a good job in setting up everything so that in some respects there can be less description, a few more info dumps, but a lot more action into Green Angel Tower. He's effectively established the world in which the characters can play out the plots. And there are multiple plots going on within this, multiple stories, if we want to use plot in the Aristotelian sense of mythos, an actual story that's being articulated with all of the attendant things, conflicts, developments, revelations about who's who and what's going on. So there's a lot of that woven into this. And what we can say is that there is this massive war going on, and at least for, really the majority, not just the majority of the series and of this book, but 90% of the way, the evil forces, they don't necessarily have the upper hand in terms of combat, right? We see that there's a great battling that's taking place around the community that Joshua has established at the Stone of Farewell, between the Erskine Guard, led by kind of a foppish foolish character with some mercenaries against the people that he has there as well. And then, they're joined by Camaris, the greatest knight who has ever existed in Osten-Ard. There's others that are coming, and we're going to see the Scythia are going to play a major role. And then we roll out, and we see that eventually they're able to go to Naban and take it over. Camaris is going to be the pivotal character in that, although he doesn't want to rule or anything like that. Benegaris, who has killed his own father to betray Joshua to Elias in the previous books, is going to be deposed himself. And there's a lot of other things going on. So it seems like there's some triumphs on the side of the good people, right? Those who are not on the side of the Storm King and the Norn Queen and Pirates and Elias and all of these people. But, we're going to see, and we'll talk about these plots within plots, that there is a larger plot in which even the things that the forces of goodness, and we'll use the word humanity writ large, so it includes the Scythian and other races as well, humanness, those forces are actually being incorporated into a larger plan. So it's a really well-crafted narrative with some interesting world building going on. There were a few things that I wanted to bring out in particular. Obviously, with a volume this massive, we're not going to get to everything. But there's some what we can call info dumps. And Williams, to his credit, always places these as revelations within the mouths of characters who are engaging in dialogue, often reflective dialogue or question and answer dialogue with each other. And the first really big one is happening early on. It's the disgraced monk who has played a pretty big role, Kadrak, also known by a number of other names, who is now reunited with somebody who he's got a complex relationship, Miramele, and she says, what does all this have to do with you? And he says, it's a long tale. And she says, well, we don't have much time, or we have much else to do. Tell me. And Kadrak is going to talk for pages about his disgrace, his fall, and he's going to reveal some important things along the way. So he says, if I go back to the true beginnings of my story, then the later parts will be easier to understand, and that way I can also postpone the most shameful tales for a little while longer. It is not a happy story, Miramela, and it winds through a great deal of shadow that has now fallen over many people besides a drunken Henstiri monk. I was born in Cranhir, when I say I'm Kadraki Cranhir, only the last part is true. I was born Pedrick. I've had other names too, few of them pleasant. I stretch no truth when I say that Cranhir is one of the strangest cities in all of Osten-Ard, and I'm actually going to skip over most of that. He does say this. Cranhir was one of the first cities built by men in Osten-Ard, and that age breathes in everything, so that people talk quietly from birth, and as though they are afraid if they speak too loud, the old walls will tumble down and expose all their secrets to the light of day. Some people say the Scythia had a hand in the making of the place, although we Henstyr men are never foolish enough to disbelieve in the Scythia, unlike some of our neighbors. I, for one, do not think the peaceful ones had anything to do with Cranhir. I've seen Scythia ruins. They're nothing like the cramped and self-protective walls of the city in which I spent my childhood. No, men built it, frightened men, if my eyes tell me anything. He goes on and he says, I spent most of my childhood wanting to get away. And so he does. And he goes to the Tenthane library. He found only the kindred souls in that entire walled prison, people who, like myself, lived for the lights of earlier days and who enjoyed running down a little bit of lost lore, the way some men revel in chasing down a buck deer and putting an arrow in its heart. And that is where I met Morganes, the, character who we met originally in Dragonbone Share. He dies fairly early on, but he leaves a vast shadow. Morganes was a scholar, a man who could do some magic, as we'll talk about a bit later, but saw danger in that, and who was the great opponent of Pirates, along with the other members of the Order of the Scroll. So he goes on and he says, the doctor spent many hours among the scrolls of the Tethane library and knew the archives better than even the old priests who watched over them. He saw my interest in matters of history and forgotten lore, took me in hand, guiding me towards useful paths I would otherwise never have found. When some years had passed and he saw that my devotion to learning was not a thing to be sloughed off with my childhood, he told me of the League of the Scroll, which was formed long ago by St. Aelstan Fiskerne, the Hayholt's Fisher king. Aelstan inherited Fingal's castle and his sword Miniar, but he wanted nothing to do with the Rimmersman heritage of destruction, especially the destruction of learning. Aelstan wanted instead to conserve knowledge that might otherwise vanish into shadow and to use that knowledge when it seemed necessary. Now, Aelstan, we're going to find out in the rest of this book, is going to have a, let's call him descendant or representative, who will be quite important. We'll come back to that in a moment, right? So the princess says, use it for what? We often argued about that, princess. It was never for good or for righteousness. The scroll bearers realized that once such a broad ideal is in place, one must meddle in everything. I suppose the clearest explanation is that the League acts to protect its own learning, to prevent a dark age that would bury again the secrets it has so laboriously unearthed. But at other times, the League has acted only to protect itself rather than its products, right? So he's going to go on. He talks about meeting the other scroll bearers, Sosastra of Perduin. Perduin is this island kingdom near Naban that has sort of a little sister relationship with it. It's very much devoted to commercialism, but also as a place of learning. The inn at Quanaktul that I spoke of earlier belongs to her, by the way. She was a fiercely clever woman, denied by her sex the life she would have otherwise have led. She should have been a king's minister. Sosastra also accepted me and then introduced me to a pair of her own candidates, for she and Morganes had long had it in their mind to bring the numbers of the League back up to 7, traditionally its full measure. Both of them were younger than I was. Dinivan was a mere youth at the time, studying with the Assyrian brothers. Going on further, we met the next year in Tungrol at the Longhouse of Tresholt. The number of the Leagues of the Scroll were 7 once more. And he goes on and he's going to talk about how it is that he studied so many things, but also, got involved with this terrible Pirates, who the seeds of great evil must have been in already, otherwise it could not have flowered so swiftly and so forcefully. Going on as further, right, he's going to talk about why he began drinking, right? He said, I became a drunkard in earnest, no local clown who drinks too many pots and sings the neighbors awake on his way home, but a chill-spirited, heart-lonely seeker of oblivion. My books were my only solace, but even they seemed to me full of the breath of tombs. They spoke only of dead lives, dead thoughts, and worst of all, dead and juiceless hopes, 1,000,000 of them stillborn for every one that had a brief butterfly moment under the sun. So what do we have here? We have somebody who goes the wrong direction through his studies. He thinks about the existential import of what it is that he's reading and the fact that all of these people are now long dead and everything that they believed in and hoped for most likely has not come to pass. So he goes on and talks about his drinking more and more, being essentially kicked out of his society. And he says the wine was only to dull the pain, right? And he says, I've done enough wrong to justify any punishment, right? So he goes on and he's going to talk about finding important works. And we're going to come back to this in a bit when we talk about the swords and the book of Nisus. But He says this: even before I'd found Nisa's book, I'd gone far down the wrong path, learning things no man should learn who wishes to sleep well at night, and I was jealous of my fellow scroll bearers, jealous of their simple happiness with their studies, angry with their calm assurance that all that could be examined could be understood. They were so certain if they could look closely enough at the nature of the world, they could divine all its purposes, but I had something they had not, a book the mere reading of which would not only prove to them things I'd already suggested, but which would crumble the pillars of their understanding. I was full of rage, but I was full of despair. The world is different once Nisus has explained it. It is as though the pages of his book were dipped in some slow poison that kills the spirit. I touched all of them. And he talks about, selling off pages of the book and Pirates putting the book back together, his terrible torture by Pirates, and, going on, he finishes up the story. So this is a really important. It is in some sense about the world as seen through Nisa's eyes and Kadrak's eyes, perhaps also through Pirates' eyes as well. Another important discussion takes place, and it's spread out through a couple different things, but Camaras, who is this legendary great knight who served the previous High King, and now is working with Joshua after having recovered his wits, is training Simon, and he tells him some interesting things. So here's part of his discourse. He says, "Attend me well. The canon of knighthood tells that as we are made in the image of our Lord, so is the world made in the semblance of heaven, but woefully without its grace. All the angels are the minions and messengers of God the highest. So does the fraternity of knighthood serve its various earthly rulers. The angels bring forth God's good works, which are absolute, but the earth is flawed, so are our rulers, even the best. Thus there will be disagreement as to what is God's will. There will be war." He divided the inner circle with a single line. "By this test will the righteousness of our rulers be made known. It is war that most closely reflects the knife edge of God's will, since war is the hinge on which earthly empires rise or fall. If strength alone were to determine victory, strength unmitigated by honor or mercy, there could be no victory, because God's will can never be revealed by the mere exercise of greater strength. Is the cat more beloved of God than the mouse?" Camaras shook his head gravely, turned his sharp eyes on his audience. "Are you listening?" "Yes," Simon said quickly. Jeremias only nodded. "So, all angels, excepting the one who fled, are obedient to God above all, because he is perfect, all-knowing, and all-capable." Camaras drew a series of ticks on the outer circle, representing the angels, Simon supposed. In truth, he was a bit confused, but he also felt he could grasp much of what the knight was saying, so he clung to what he could and waited. "But," the old man continued, "the rulers of men are, as aforesaid, flawed. They are sinners, as are we all. Thus, although each knight is loyal to his liege, he must also be loyal to the canon of knighthood, all the rules of battle and comportment, all the rules of honor and mercy and responsibility, which is the same for all knights. So no matter which earthly ruler wins a struggle, if his knights are true to their canon, the battle will have been won according to God's law. It will be a just reflection of his will. Do you hear me?" He goes on and he says, "Now, just as God's priest must render his will understandable to the people in a form that is pleasing and reverent, so too must his knights prosecute his wishes in a similar fashion. This is why war, however horrible, should not be a fight among animals. That is why a knight is more than simply a strong man on a horse. He is God's vicar on the battlefield. Swordplay is prayer, lad, serious and sad, yet joyful. And that is why one does not become a knight just by the passing of a vigil and the tapping of a sword any more than one might become a priest by carrying the Book of Adon from one side of a village to another. There is study in every part." He turned to Simon. "Stand up and hold your sword, young man." And he starts teaching him swordsmanship. But he's also teaching him about this canon of knighthood, which very few people seem to be following, including the people who are sirs or lords or barons or earls or things like that. So a very interesting set of observations there, also giving us a glimpse into this world that we're looking at. What else do we learn about? Well, one of the big revelations has to do with the various races. We already know quite a bit about the Scythi and to some degree about the Norns. We'll come back to that in a bit. And we got introduced to the Niskis and to the Draros, who are also children of the sea they crossed. And to some degree, they're understood as lesser servitor races. So we learn about them through an interesting discussion that is happening here, a discussion between Eolar and Jariki. So Jariki says, "The ocean people were ever gentle. That is why my people brought them, I fear, because they felt they would be tractable servants." Eolar says, "What did you mean some of them were called that? Were there Tinduka, the servant races, who were not Draros?" "Oh yes, those who lived here, the Draros as you call them, were a smallish group who'd split off from the main tribe. The rest of Ruyan's folk stayed close to water, since the oceans were always dear to their heart. Many of them became what the mortals call sea watchers." Niskis? In his long career, during which he'd often traveled in southern waters, Eolar had met many sea watchers. They still exist, but they look nothing like the Draros. Jariki paused to let the count catch up, and then he says, "Well, that was Tindayuka's blessing as well as their curse. They could change themselves over time to better fit the place that they lived. There's a certain mutability in their blood and bones. I think that if the world were to be destroyed by fire, the ocean children would be the only ones to survive. Before long, they would be able to eat smoke and swim in hot ashes." "But that is astounding," said Eolar. "The Draros I met, Ysfidri and his companions, seemed so timid. Who could ever dream they were capable of such things?" "There are lizards in the southern marches," Jariki said with a smile, "that can change their color to match the leaf or trunk or stone on which they crouch. They are timid too. It does not seem odd to me that the most frightened creatures are often the best at hiding themselves." And he says, "But if your people gave the Draros this place, why are they so afraid of you? When the Lady Magwin and myself first came here and met them, they were terrified we might be servants of yours come to drag them back." And Jariki says, "Well, they are right to be frightened, Count Eolar. Amaterasu, our wise one who's just been taken to us, called our dealings with the Tinacadia our great shame. We did not treat them well, and we kept them from things they deserved to know because we thought they would make better servants if they labored in ignorance. When Jennyana, Year Dancing House's mistress, gave them this place in the distant past, she was opposed by many of the houses of Dawn. There are those among the Zydia even to this day who feel we should have kept Ruyan Vei's children as servants. They are right to fear your friends." "None of these things were in our old legends of your folk," Eolar marveled. "You paint a grim, sad picture. Why do you tell all this?" And Jariki says, "Because, Count Eolar, that era will soon be gone. That does not mean I think happier things are coming, although there's always a chance. But for better or worse, this age of the world is ending." We read as well, much, much later on in the work, below the castle, that when the Draros are being encountered as well and urged to actually take some action, we find out that the Draro says, "We are all ocean children. Some decided to stay near the sea, which forever separates us from the garden of our birth. Others chose more hidden and secretive ways, like the earth's dark places and the task of shaping stone. You see, unlike our cousins, the Zydia and Hidika, the Scythi and the Norns, we children of the Navigator can shape ourselves just as we shape other things." And Miramel says, "You And the Niskis are the same. Now she understood the phantom of recognition that had troubled her upon first seeing Yisfidri. There was something in his bones, in his way of moving, that reminded her of Gan Itai, the Niski who saved her life and turned over the ship of Pirates' henchmen, who was going to turn Miriamela over to him by summoning up the Kilpa to attack the sailors, and then she herself is killed, right? So she says, so you and the Niskis are the same, and Niskis forged Thorn. We're going to come back to this theme of the great swords in just a bit. So the Niskis and the Draros are actually of the same original kin, which is kind of a big revelation. A couple other important bits of information. There's a discussion of what they call witnesses and the connection to the dream road, which we get out of the mouth of the Sithi Aditu, who at one point we think could, possibly down the line be somebody that Simon would be very closely associated with. So she is going to tell us about the master witness. And Simon says, well, what is that? And she says, well, you know what a witness is. Jariki gave you his mirror. That's a minor witness, and there's many of them still in existence. There were only a few master witnesses, each more or less bound to a place. The Pool of Three Depths in Asawa, under the Hayholt, the Speakfire in Hikakayo, the Green Column in Gina Tsiene, and most of those are broken or ruined or lost. Here at Sesdrua, the stone of departure, it was a great stone set beneath the ground, a stone called the Earth Drake's Eye. Earth Drake is another name. It's difficult to explain the differences between the two in your tongue. For the greater worm who bites at his own tail, we built this entire place on top of that stone. It was not quite a master witness. In fact, it was not even a witness by itself, but such was its potency that a minor witness like my brother's mirror would be a master witness if used here. And so he says, well, what does that mean? Aditu. And so here's what she tells him. A minor witness will lead you onto the road of dreams, but will usually show you only those you know or those who are looking for you. A master witness, if used by someone who knew the ways of it, could look on anyone or anything, and sometimes into other times and other places. So you could say it has a certain epistemological priority that you can understand why the powerful beings that know about them would definitely want to be using. She also tells us something really important during the discussion of potential marriage and coupling and all of those sorts of things. Originated by the story between Simon and this great princess character, Miramele, who is arguably the second most important character in these stories. So she is going to talk about why it is that the Norns and the Sithi are really two radically different groups. So she says, it's a very long story, sailmen, perhaps the longest our people tell, accepting only the flight from the garden and are coming across the Black Seas to this land. So we're getting some lore here, right? She says, at that time, Atuku and her husband ruled all the Gardenborn. They were the keepers of the year-dancing groves. When her son fell in love with Nenaisu, daughter of Jeniana, and her mate Initri, Utuku furiously opposed it. Why? Well, Nanaisu's parents were of Arzidya clan, although it had a different name in those long ago days. They were also of the belief that the mortals who'd come to this land after the Gardenborn had arrived should be permitted to live as they would, so long as they did not make war on our people. So we see a massive division here about what to do about these upstart human beings coming in and messing things up. Atuku and her clan felt the mortals should be pushed back across the ocean, and those who would not leave should be killed, as some mortal farmers crush the insects they find on their crops. But since the two great clans and the other smaller clans, allied with one or the other, were so evenly divided, even Utuku's position as mistress of Year Dancing House did not permit her to force her will on the rest. You see, Salmon, we have never had kings and queens as you mortals have. In any case, Utuku and her husband were fiercely angry their son had married a woman of what they considered to be the traitorous, mortal-loving clan that opposed them. When Anaisu was slain, Druki went mad and swore he would kill every mortal he found. The men of Naisu's clan restrained him, and though they were in their own way as bitterly angry and horrified as he, when the Ysera was called, the Garden-born could come to no decision, but enough feared what might happen if Druki was free that they decided he must be confined, something that had never happened this side of the ocean. It was too much for him, too much for his madness, to be held prisoner by his own people while those he deemed his wife murderers went free. Druki made himself die. And so he asks, is that why Utuku and the Norns hate mortals? And she says, yes, but they also went to war with some of the first mortals in Henstir way back long before Heron gave it the name. In that fighting, Ekamenso and many of the other Hidika lost their lives. So they have other grudges to nurse as well. And so what we find is there's a complex story here about the separation of the two peoples and about the different orientation towards the mortals. And we see that this is a common theme throughout these stories. Misunderstandings, anger, hatred, fear wind up driving all sorts of long-standing conflicts, which lead not just to the separation in terms of borders, Norns living in the north, Scythi living elsewhere, or clashes between mortals and mortal men and the Scythi, or things like that, but also to these grand plots that are taking place as well, which will involve practically every inhabitant of Osten-Ard. So that's probably enough about the world building. We got some philosophical themes to explore when it comes to this series as well. We'll see if we can get to as many of these as we can, because again, such a massive and rich work. There's so much here to examine. One of the interesting philosophical themes that we can talk about is, you could call it an intersection between ethics and epistemology. What is it we should do? What's good? What's bad? What's better? What's worse on the one hand? And how do we know any of this stuff on the other hand? And before we look at a few passages in the text where Williams is having his characters, particularly Simon, and although also some of the other ones, reflecting on how difficult it is to draw neat, clear lines between good and evil on, one side and the other, I do want to say something. We've talked a little bit already about the importance of J.R.R. Tolkien, and we've mentioned George R.R. Martin as well, somebody who was very influenced by this series. And it's become a trope, and actually a foolish trope, to say, well, it's partly also inspired by some things that George R.R. Martin has said. His world, it's gray, nobody is completely good or completely evil, whereas Tolkien, you knew exactly who the good guys were and the bad guys were. And, if you've actually read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or Silmarillion, and I would say this is even there in The Hobbit, it's not that clear. As a matter of fact, there's some evil characters who think that what they're doing is actually for the greatest good, greater good, or greatest good. Think about Saruman, for example, as a character, or, in the Silmarillion, some of the elvish characters who cause all sorts of trouble. And, evil is very much a corruption of, or perversion or lack of the good in Tolkien. So, I don't want to fall into this, it gets gray and grimdark or something like that, as like, this is an advance beyond Tolkien. But it is a little bit let's say, clearer, perhaps. And I think that there's some really interesting passages here. So there's this conversation that's going on between Benedict the troll and Simon, two very good friends. And so I'm just going to read it to you. They're reading some of Morganus's text, right? And Benedict says, as he is telling that the argument went on, so Morganus is going on for several pages, talking in greater depth of this question, which was of great importance in its day, or was anyway, thought to be of such importantness. And Simon says, well, so Camarus killed better but liked it less than King John did? Why did he do it then? Why not become a monk or a hermit? Ah, that is being the nub of what you were earlier wondering, Simon, Benedict said, his dark eyes intent. That is why the writing of great thinkers is being such a help to the rest of us in our own thinking. Here Morganus has put the words and names in a different way, but it is the same questioning as yours. Is it right to be killing? Even if it is what your master or country or church wishes, is it better to kill but not to enjoy it, or to not kill at all, and then perhaps be seeing bad things happening to those you are loving? Simon says, does Morganus give an answer? No, Benedict shook his head. As I said, now here's the part I really love, the wise know that these questions have no true answers. Life is made from these wonderings and from the answers that we, each and every one, are finding for ourselves. Just for once, Benedict, I want you to tell me there is an answer for something. I'm tired of thinking so much. The troll laughed. The punishment for being born. No, perhaps that is too much to be calling that. The punishment for being truly alive, that is fair to say. Welcome, Simon, to the world of those who are every day condemned to thinking and wondering and never ever knowing with certainness. Simon snorted, thank you. Yes, Simon, there was strange, somber earnestness in Strangyard's voice. Welcome. I pray that someday you will be glad that your decisions were not simple ones. How could that be? Strangyard shook his head. Forgive me for saying the kind of things that old men say, Simon, but you will see. Simon stood up. Very well, now that you've made my head spin, I will do as Sluttig did, go away and discuss and try to sleep, right? So what are we seeing here? Two really important things. One is, a lot of these ethical matters don't have easy answers, and yet we have to find them. And to be truly alive is to be bedeviled by them, because that is the way life is. Life is tricky. Life is complex. But the second thing is that the words of great thinkers can help us in this process. And, we might think about Williams referring to himself in an oblique way as the author of this book, but we could also think of this as like a call to, read history, to read philosophy, to read whatever else we can find. Simon is posed with the problems of making decisions from the very beginning of this work, right? So the very first page in the first chapter, under strange skies, after the episode with Goodwolf. So Simon is thinking about stuff, and he says, "So now I'm a man. Well, almost a man." And he thinks about this, and he says, here we go. Was that what being grown meant, having a lot of scars? He supposed it also meant learning from the wounds as well, but what could he learn from the sort of things that had happened to him in the last year, in the previous two books? Don't let your friends get killed, he thought sourly. That's one. Don't go out in the world and get chased by monsters and madmen. Don't make enemies. So much for the words of wisdom that people were always so eager to share with him. No decisions were ever as easy as they seemed in Father Dreosan's sermons, where people always got to make a clean choice between evil's way and Adon's way. In Simon's recent experience of the world, all the choices seem between one unpleasant possibility and another, with only the faintest reference to good and evil. That's a great way of thinking about it. They do have reference to good and evil, but you got to work at it to get them. And then we find a little bit later on that there's a discussion going on between Simon and Prince Joshua. And Joshua is saying, I dreamed of a son who would love learning and justice but have none of my failings. Now I hope our child is a girl. If we lost and he survived, a son of mine would be hunted forever. Elias would not let him live. And if we were to win somehow, yes? If we were to win and I took my father's throne, one day I would have to send my son off to do something I could not do, something dangerous and glorious. That is the way of kings and their sons. And I could never sleep again waiting to hear that he'd been killed. That is what I hate about ruling and royalty, Simon. It is living, breathing people with whom a prince plays the games of statecraft. I sent you and Benabik and the others into danger. You, who are little more than a child. No, I know you are a young man. Who knighted you after all? But that does not ease my remorse. With Adon's mercy, you survived my attention, but other companions of yours did not. Simon hesitated a moment before speaking. But being a woman does not save anyone from being caught by war, Prince Joshua. Think of Miriamela. Think of your wife, Lady Vorjeva. Joshua nodded slowly. I fear you're right, and there will be more fighting, more war, and more helpless ones will die. And then he, says, Benabik is going to kick me for this, taking his ward out and speaking to him of death and misery. But, Simon is thinking about all of these matters, right? So a little bit later on, we get some more discussion of this grand theme of the difficulty, but the needfulness of figuring out what one needs to do. And this has to do with war. Simon is actually experiencing war firsthand. Whatever beliefs about the nobility of war that Simon still retained died during that long day on the frozen lake. In the midst of such terrible carnage with fallen friends and enemies alike scattered about, maimed and bloody, some even made faceless by terrible wounds, with the crying and pleading of dying men ringing in his ears, their dignity ripped away from them, with the air rank with the stenches of fear, sweat, blood, and excrement. It was impossible to see warfare as anything other than what Morganis had once termed a kind of hell on earth that impatient mankind had arranged so it would not have to wait for the afterlife. To Simon, the grotesque unfairness of it was almost the worst of all. For every armored knight dragged down, half a dozen foot soldiers were slaughtered. Even animals suffered torments that should have not been visited on murderers and traitors. And he goes down. Even the king's Erkenguard might have wished to be elsewhere rather than here on this killing ground where duty brought them and loyalty prisoned them. Only the mercenaries were here by choice. To Simon, the minds of men who had come to this of their own will were suddenly as incomprehensible as the thoughts of spiders or lizards, less so even for the small creatures of the earth, almost always fled from danger. These were madmen, Simon realized, and that was the direst problem of the world, that madmen should be strong and unafraid so that they could force their will on the weak and peace-loving. If God allowed such madness to be, Simon could not help thinking, then he was an old god who had lost his grip. Right? So this is leading to a kind of despair on his part. And then I'm going to bring up one other similar sentiment. So Simon and Benabik are sitting together, and Simon says, I just don't know how to be. These men have come to kill us. I want them all to die painfully, horribly. But Benabik, these are the Erkenguard. I knew them at the castle. Some of them used to give me sweets or lift me up on their horses and tell me that I reminded them of their own sons. Which is right? How could they do these things to us who never did them any harm? But the king is making them, so why should they be killed any more than us? Benabik's lips curled in a tiny smile. I notice you're not having worries about the mercenaries. No, say nothing. There is no need. It's hard to feel sorry for those who are searching out war for gold. And then he says, the questions you're asking are important ones, but they are also questions without answers. This is what being a man or woman means, I am thinking, instead of a boy or a girl, child. You must be finding your own solution to questions that are having no true answers. And this is when they go to read Morganis's book. I think that we could, also look at a character like Hadrak, who is so damaged, but, also eventually does good things here and there as an example of all of this sort of stuff as well. He says to Miramel, I am a thief and a liar and a drunkard, and that is the truth of many years. That I did a few honest deeds does not change that. And she says, why do you always say such things? Why are you determined to see the worst in yourself? The look on his face became something almost accusatory. And why are you determined to see the best in me? You imagine you know all about the world, but you are only a young girl after all is said and done. There are limits to your imagination, to your understanding of how black a place the world can truly be. So, he's seen more of it than her. He's despairing, of course. And, I think this is a great place to begin our exploration of the philosophical themes. Can you actually figure out what is right and what is wrong? Kamaris is teaching about the, knighthood and what it means, but does he actually live up to it? We're going to find that he is carrying great remorse and sorrow around himself. So that's one major philosophical theme. Let's now explore some of the others. Since we've already talked about Simon and we've already touched on arguably the second most important character in these novels, Miriamela, maybe we should talk about the grand theme of their love story as it's developing. And I do have a few things to say before we start looking at important passages in the book. And one of them is going to be that what we can see going on in these novels with both of these characters is coming of age stories, right? So it's not just that, but it's definitely involving that. Simon starts out as a scullion boy. By the beginning of this book, he's a knight, and he's going to be fighting. He's got a beard and all of that, but he's still pretty young. And the princess, by the time that we are encountering her early on in this book, she has done a bunch of different things. She left Joshua's camp with Kadrak, winds up going all the way down to the southeast, manages to escape Ospetus, but sleeps with him as well, which is a shame that she ends up carrying around with her. That's going to drive a wedge between her and Simon, and they're coming together. They're getting to know each other. They've met each other at different points. Earlier on in Dragonbone Chair, she's given him a token, right? A scarf to wrap around. They've met a couple different times, and they're falling in love with each other. Now, I think that it's really well done. The one thing that I don't like about this, and I suppose it only tangentially has to do with the love story, is the chosen one motif. Simon is clearly the chosen one, right? He fights a dragon, winds up being marked by it, recovers the great sword Thorn in the process. He's getting tougher and tougher and stronger and learning things along the way. And it turns out that he's not just a scullion boy. He's actually the heir of one of the greatest kings ever, the Fisher King, who was the predecessor to, the High King Prester John. So, was that really necessary? I guess from a plot perspective, we do get some reasons why it could be. And we do find out that she loves him even if he's just a scullion boy by the end. But I don't know. It all works out a little bit too conveniently that way. And during their adventures, there's a lot of sort of lucky accidents. They get taken by the fire dancers. Binnabic happens to get them out of that scrape. And, there's a lot of things like that going on. But it is a really interesting story. The other thing that I do want to mention is that Simon, because he's knighted and he's clearly a growing tough guy and there's stories being told about him, the local girls are quite interested in him. And he actually kisses one of them. And then Aditu, the Scythe, whatever you want to call her, Scythe, you can't call her a young woman. She's young from a Scythe perspective, but quite old from a human perspective. She shows up and actually scares them off saying, are you, kissing my consort? And, there's some suspense during the story. Is Simon going to end up with her instead of with Miramella? And, I think Williams did a great job in developing that. And so that might be, there's good places to start. I will come back to Aditu in a moment, but I do want to bring up one passage that I had marked. So we find that she's thinking, when I say she, Miramella is thinking to herself and talking with Isgrimnur, and telling him about what's going on. And she is going to say, when Ospatus captured us, I never believed he would truly manage to take me away. If he had, I would have escaped. You see, in truth, it's not funny at all, but it seems to be there are things happening that are beyond our strength. Like waves on the ocean, huge waves. I can fight them and drown, or I can let them carry me and swim just enough to keep my head above the water. I know I'm going to see Uncle Joshua again. I just know. And Simon, and Binnabic, and Vorjeva. There's more to be done. That's all. Isgrimnur looked at her warily, as though the little girl he'd once knee-dandled had become a Nabani star reader. And what then, when we're all together again? Miramella smiled at him, but it was only the bittersweet tip of a great sorrow that washed through her. The wave will crash, dear Uncle Isgrimnur, and some of us will go down and never come up. I don't know how it will be. Of course not, but I'm not as frightened as I used to be. I think that's a great passage. And then we have this interesting discourse with Aditu after she, scares off these others, right? And so she's asking him, what's going on with you? And Simon guessed even if a companion showed up without a leg missing, they might take a couple seasons before they asked. And so she's actually saying, you're upset, Sayomen. I've seen it in your play. You play well enough that your moods carry over to the house of Shent. He says, I'm not upset. Well, maybe I am, but it's nothing you could tell me anything about. And he says, I don't understand women. I just don't understand them. What do you mean, Sayomen? Surely you understand some things. I often say I do not understand mortals, but I know what they look like and how long they live, and I can speak a few of their languages. And he says, I suppose it's not all women. I don't understand Miramella, the princess. Oh, the thin one with the yellow hair? She was playing with him. If you like, but I can see it's stupid to talk to you about it. Aditu leaned forward and touched his arm. I am sorry, Sayomen. I've made you angry. Tell me what is bothering you, if you would you like. Perhaps even if I know little about mortals, speaking will make you feel happier. He shrugged, embarrassed that he'd brought it up. I don't know. She's kind to me sometimes, and other times she acts as if she hardly knows me. Sometimes she looks at me like I frighten her. Me! I saved her life. Why should she be frightened of me? If you saved her life, that is one possible reason, Aditu was serious. Ask my brother. Having your life saved by someone is a very great responsibility. But Jiriki doesn't act like he hates me. My brother is of an old and reserved race, though among the Zidya he and I are thought to be quite youthfully impulsive and dangerously unpredictable. And no, he doesn't hate you. Jiriki thinks very highly of you, Sailman Snowlock. He would have never brought you to Jawa Tanuki otherwise, which confirmed in the minds of many of our folk he's not entirely trustworthy. But your Miramele is a mortal girl and very young. There are fish in the river outside that have lived longer than she has. Do not be surprised she finds owing someone her life to be a difficult burden. Simon stared at her. He had expected more teasing, but Aditya was talking sensibly about Miramele, and she was telling him things about the Sithi he'd never heard her say. He was torn between two fascinating subjects. That's not all. At least I don't think it is. I don't know how to be with her, with Princess Miramele. I think about her all the time, but who am I to think about a princess? Aditya laughed, a sparkling sound like falling water. You are Sailman the Bold. You saw the Yasira. You met First Grandmother. What other young mortal can say that? He felt himself blushing. But that's not the point. She is a princess, Aditya, the High King's daughter. The daughter of your enemy? Is that why you're troubled? No. You are the daughter of the king and queen of the Zidya, aren't you? That is more or less how it would be said in your speech. I am of the year-dancing house, yes. Well, what if someone who was from, I don't know, an unimportant family, a bad house or something like that, wanted to marry you? A bad house? Aditya looked at him carefully. Do you ask whether I would consider another of my folk to be beneath me? We have been too few for that, Sailman, and why must you marry her? Do your people never make love without being married? Simon was speechless for a moment. Make love to the king's daughter without the thought of marrying her? I am a knight, he said stiffly. I have to be honorable. Loving someone is not honorable? She shook her head. And you say you do not understand me, Sailman. You mean that your people don't care who marries who? I don't believe it. And then she says, and we talked about this a bit earlier, that is what tore us under the Zidya and Hidika. We have learned from that terrible lesson. Right? So, she's presenting him with the idea that, well, you could be the scullion, but perhaps that doesn't actually make that much difference. Love is love. And we see Miramele later on when Simon is lost in the caverns below after they try to get the sword on their, great trek to the Hayholt. We find her thinking about these things. Miramele's mind went wandering again. Simon is gone, and I never had a chance to really talk to him. Did I love him? It would have never have come to anything. How could he care for me after I told him about Aspitis? But perhaps we could have been friends, but did I love him? It's useless to wonder, but I suppose I did, thinking that she felt something vast and unformed struggling inside her, a grief that threatened to turn into madness. She fought it down, afraid of its strength. Oh God, is this all there is to life? To have something precious and to only realize it after it's too late. So, she's definitely regretting the breach between them. And we're going to see that they are going to, in the end, come together at the very resolution after we could call it the climax of the story. So here we go. Simon is waiting for Miramele, and she is not coming. He'd found her in her tent in conversation with Aditya, who earlier that morning had been one of his own visitors. She had greeted him in a friendly enough fashion and exclaimed sorrowfully over his various wounds as he had over hers. But when he expressed his sadness over the deaths of her uncle and father, she'd suddenly grown cold and remote. Simon wanted to believe it was no more than the justifiable bitterness of someone who'd lived through a terrible time and had lost her family, not to mention her own unhappy role in her father's death, but he could not fool himself that there was nothing more to her reaction than that. She'd been reacting to him, too, as if there was something about Simon that still made her dreadfully uncomfortable. It made him miserable to see the distance in her eyes after all they'd been together. But he'd also felt fury, wondering why he should be treated as though it had been his cruelty to her that had marred their trip into Erkenland instead of the other way around. Though he'd struggled to hide his anger, things had grown only chillier between them, and at last he excused himself and went out into the wind. However, just a few pages later, we are going to find, well, 10 pages later, that she actually is going to suggest that they should be together. So she says, let's go away. We can take the horses and be a half dozen leagues from here by morning. I don't want to be a queen. Please don't leave me. Go away? Where and why would I leave you? Mirabelle, what are you talking about? Curse you, Simon. Are you really as foolish as people used to think you were? She now grabbed his hand in both of hers. Tears gleamed on her cheeks. I don't care if you were a kitchen boy. I don't care if that your father was a fisherman. I only want you, Simon. Oh, do you think I'm an idiot? I am an idiot, I suppose. Her laugh had a touch of wildness to it. She let go of his hand for a moment to wipe at her eyes again. I've been brooding about this ever since the tower fell. I can't stand it. Uncle Iskramir and the others, they're going to make me take the throne. I know they will, and I'll go back to being the old Mirabelle again, except this time it will be 1,000 times worse. It will be a prison, and then I'll have to marry some other fangball. Just because he's dead doesn't mean there aren't 100 more like him, and I'll never have another adventure or be free or do what I want to, and you'll go away, Simon. I'll lose you, the only one I really care about. He stood, then pulled her up from the stone so he could put her arms around her. They were both shaking, and for a little time all he could do was grapple her to him and hang on, as though the wind might sweep her away. I've loved you so long, Mirabelle. He could not keep his voice steady. You frighten me. You don't know how you frighten me. Her voice was muffled against his chest. I don't know what you see when you look at me, but please don't go away, she said urgently. Whatever happens, don't go away. I won't. He leaned back so he could see her. Her eyes were bright, fresh tears trembling on the lower lashes. His own eyes were blurring as well. He laughed, his voice cracked. I won't leave you. I promised I wouldn't, don't you remember? Sir Seaman, my Simon, you are my love. How did it happen? He leaned forward, pressing his mouth against hers, and as they clung to each other, the starry sky seemed to spin around the place where they stood. Simon's hands moved beneath her cloak, and he ran his fingers down the long muscles of her back. Mirabelle shuddered and pulled him closer, rubbing her damp face against his neck. Feeling the length of her pressed against him filled Simon with a kind of drunken, joyous madness. With his arms still locked around her, he took a few staggering steps towards the tent. He tasted the salt of her tears and covered her eyes and cheeks and lips with kisses as her hair swirled around him and stuck to his damp face. So they make love, and then he says, I've loved you so long. And they'll end up being the king and queen together, because as of course it turns out, as we said, Simon, of course, is of royal blood himself, so all of those problems go away. But I think that this is actually, it's tough to write good love stories without it turning maudlin or becoming the main theme of the story. And Williams wove this in quite well. And we do have, some others, Joshua and Vorjeva. We have, some other examples of people who genuinely love each other. But this is a grand story that is all, they are each other's destinies in certain ways. In this book, we don't get a sustained, long, sort of philosophical treatise-style reflection on the nature of evil or anything like that, but we get a lot of really great depiction and musing about the nature of the evil forces that are threatening Oost and Ard, and this grand plan or plot that is being developed. And I think that you can say that there are a lot of moving pieces to it, but there's 4 main players. We've got seemingly the biggest baddie is Inaluki, the Storm King, right, who is essentially a spirit. We'll talk more about him in just a bit. We encountered him in the first 2 novels. And of course, we have the queen of the Norns, Utuku, who is very, very old. And we actually get some point of view chapters or portions of chapters focus directly on her in this book. We got a little bit of that previously, like with Jagger, who dies by the end of the second book, and going back and encountering her. But we get to learn more about her plotting and what she's up to in this, and perhaps even her motivations. And then we have Pirates, the red alchemist, sorcerer, whatever else we want to call him. Clearly another evil character, very hard to kill, as we find out towards the end of this novel. We already saw that with the attack on him by Rachel the Dragon in the previous novel. And then we have King Elias. And what's really interesting to me for all of this is that they're all talking as if they're working together, but they are actually, to some degree, hoping to use each other and kind of at cross purposes with each other sometimes, right? So, like, for example, Pirates is going to describe himself as a person here we go. I am what a man who accepts no limits can become. So he's involved in this plotting, and as opposed to everybody else who recognizes limits and stays within them, he will go beyond them. And we see that the forces of evil are seemingly in an alliance that is always a couple steps ahead of the good people, right? So, or the ones who may not necessarily be good, but are at least not evil, right? And so we find out. So here's an interesting passage, right? We're finding out that there's a mystery of what it is that they actually want. And Kuroki, one of the Sithi, is talking with the others and with Eolar, and he says, we've tried to learn more about death and unbeing. And Eolar asks, these Norns were fighting are living creatures, but their master is not? Could they be trying to bring the Storm King back to life? Eolar's question brought neither derisive laughter nor shocked silence. We have thought on this. Likamaya was blunt. It cannot happen. Inaluki is dead. Kuroki spoke more softly. There are some things we know about only little, but death we know very well. Well, indeed, very well indeed. Inaluki is dead. He cannot return to this world. But you told me he was in Stormspike, Eolar said to Jarika. You said the Norns do as he bids. Are we at war against something imaginary? It is indeed confusing, Count Eolar, Jariki replied. Inaluki, although he is not truly Inaluki anymore, has no more existence than a sort of dream. He is an evil and vengeful dream, one that possesses all the craftiness that the Storm King had in life, as well as knowledge of the ultimate darkness as no living thing has ever had. But he is only a dream for all that. Trust that I speak truly, as we can travel on the road of dreams and see and feel things here. So Inaluki can speak to his followers in Nagika through the breathing harp, which is one of the greatest of the master witnesses. Though I would guess that Utuku alone has the skill to even understand him. So he is not a thing, Eolar, with an existence in this world. He is not real like this cloth is real, like the ground is real beneath our feet. But that does not mean that he cannot do great evil. And Utuku and her servitors are more than real enough. Right? And they talk about the Red Hand, who are his greatest servants. Like him, they've passed through death and into the outer realms. But they cannot exist in this world without an immense expenditure of power by him every moment they are embodied. For they're almost as much of a deadly contradiction as he is. That is why when one of them attacked us in our fastness at Jawa Tanuki, we knew that the time had come to take up arms. Inaluki and Utuku must have been desperate to expend so much force to silence Amaterasu, the oldest of the Sithi, right? So clearly there's something going on, and we see that there's this discussion of the Gants. Not they are these sort of crab-like, arthropodic, somewhat intelligent hive creatures, and they're coming out and leaving the swamps and attacking people, and they're being driven by that. The the sea creatures are also attacking. We have these burrowing creatures that are attacking, and the giants are coming down. And we see Pirates talking about a great fear that played a role in this plot as well. So here we go. We harnessed the great fear. Pirates moved to a spot behind the king, who now seemed as trapped and helpless as the other two sword bearers. The priest spread his arms wide so that for a moment Elias seemed to have another pair of hands. In every land the fear has spread. The Kilpa make the seas boil. The Gants crawl through the streets of the southern cities. The beasts of legends stalk the snows of the earth. The fear is everywhere. We harness the great fear. In every land, brother is turned against brother. Plague and famine and the scourge of war turn people into raging demons. All the strength of fright and fury is ours, funneled through the pattern of the 5 houses. Suddenly Pirates laughed. You are all such small minds. Even your terrors are small ones. You feared to see your armies defeated? You will see more than that. You will see time itself roll backward in its rut. And that's the goal, is to turn time backwards so that Inaluki can have life again. But we're also going to see, and this is where it gets very, very interesting, that each of the evil beings thinks that it can use the others to advance its own purposes and plans, and they're actually going to be at odds with each other. So, for example, early on, we see that Elias and Pirates are talking, and here we go. So Pirates says, when he's asked, what do you want to do, Pirates? Learn. For a moment, the priest's careful mask of statecraft seemed to slip. The face of a child showed through, a horrible, greedy child. I want to know everything. For that I need power, which is a sort of permission. There are secrets so dark, so deep. The only way to discover them is to tear open the universe and root around in the very guts of death and unbeing. Elias asks, you talk strangely, priest. Death, unbeing, are they not the same? Pirates grinned maliciously, although at what was not clear. Oh, no, Majesty, not remotely, right? And so then Elias asks, do you suppose the Norns would go with Fengbald? They are fierce fighters, and cold weather are nothing to them. Pirates says, I think it unlikely, my king. They do not seem to like to travel by day, nor do they seem to enjoy the company of mortals. Not much use as allies, are they? Elias frowned. Oh, they're valuable enough, Majesty. They will render service when we truly need them. Their master, your greatest ally, will see to that. And so that's it. They're only allies. They're not actually completely on the same side. And we get this reinforced over and over and over again. We also find out this reference to unbeing, that Atuku, that is part of what is motivating her. So here we go. Aditu says, what does Atuka want, you asked? Simon, confused by what had happened, did not respond. That I could not tell you, not with certainty. She is the oldest thinking creature in all of Osten Ard, sailmen, and she's far more than twice as old as the most ancient. Be assured her ways are strange and subtle beyond even the understanding of anyone except perhaps First Grandmother, who's by this time dead. But if I had to guess, I would say this. She longs for unbeing. What does that mean? Simon was beginning to wonder if he was truly sober after all. If she wished death, Aditu said, then that would be oblivion just for herself. She is tired of living, sailmen, but she is eldest. Never forget that. As long as songs have been sung in Osenard and longer Atuku has lived, she alone of any living thing saw the lost home that birthed our kind. I do not think that she can bear to think of others living when she is gone. She cannot destroy everything, much as she might desire to. But perhaps she hopes to help create the greatest cataclysm possible, to assure that as many living folk accompany her into oblivion as she can drag with her. Simon stopped horrified. "That's terrible," he said with feeling. Aditu shrugged a sinuous gesture. She had a lovely neck. "Atuku is terrible. She is mad, Sailman, though it is a madness as tightly woven and intricate as the finest Julia ever spun. She was perhaps the cleverest of all the golden born." So this is, quite a revelation. Now, we're going to see in the very culmination of things that Pirates is going to essentially betray Elias. Elias is going to become a living vessel for Inaluki, the Storm King, but Pirates is also going to try to betray the Storm King himself. He thinks that he can use the Storm King as his own servant, right? So I'm going to read you this passage here. Pirates took a step back and averted his face. "I have done what you asked, mighty one." His smug grin was gone. The priest had willingly opened the door, but what had entered shocked even him. He took a deep breath and appeared to find some core of strength. His face again became feral. "The hour has come, but it is not your hour, it is mine. How could I trust one who hated every living thing to keep its bargain? I knew that once you had no need of me, your promises would be wind in darkness." He spread his wide-sleeved arms. "Mortal I may be, but I am no fool. You gave me the words of changing, thinking them a toy that would keep me childishly amused as I did your bidding. But I have learned, too, these words will become your cage, and then you will become my servant. All creation will bend to you, but you will bow to me." Now, what ends up happening? Well, it doesn't actually work. And then we get Pirates shuddered and wept. Forgive me, my arrogance, my foolishness. Oh, please, master, forgive me." He crawled toward the thing, banging his forehead against the almost invisible floor. "I can still do you great service. Remember what you promised me, Lord, that if I served you well, I would be first among mortals." The thing retained its grip on shifting sorrow, the sword, but extended its other blackened hand until it touched the alchemist. The fingers cupped his smooth, wet head. A voice more powerful than the bell, as ragged and deadly as the hiss of the freezing wind, scraped through the darkness despite everything else that had happened. Simon's eyes filled with frightened tears at the sound of it. "Yes, you will be first." Jets of steam lifted from beneath the king's fingers. Pirates shrieked and threw up his arms, grabbing at the hand, but the king did not move, and Pirates could not free himself. Runnels of flame sped down the alchemist's robe. Above him, the king's face was an indistinct lump of darkness, but eyes and ragged mouth blazed scarlet. The priest's scream was a sound no human being should have loosed. Vapors enveloped him, but Simon saw his threshing arms steaming, cracking, shriveling into waggling things like tree limbs. After a long moment, the priest, all bones and burning tatters, fell to the floor and twitched like a smashed cricket. The thing that had been Elias slumped head down so that nothing could be seen of it but shadow, right? And here we're going to get to the culmination. As it turns out, the prophecy of the three swords was actually there as a false messenger to get them to bring all three of these important swords, all of whom have a kind of personality to them that can use mortals to the juncture point where Inaluki, and along with his allies, can use them to change the world in a radical way. And we should say a few things about this. So we see very, very early on, there's this discussion, and this is coming from Kadrak, about the book that Mises wrote about the swords. Here we go. I had found a copy of Du Svavenvir, the fabled book of Mad Nises, the only copy I've ever heard to exist in modern days. And who was this Nises? He was a man who came out of the north beyond Everett's Halla from the land of the Black Rimmersmen who lived below Stormspike and presented himself to Fingal, king of Rimmersgard. He was no court conjurer, but it was said that he gave Fingal the power that enabled him to conquer half of Osten-Ard. That power may have been wisdom, for Nises knew the facts of things that no one else had dreamed existed. After Asua was conquered and Fingal died at last, Nises served Fingal's son Hjaldan. It was during those years he wrote his book, a book that contained part of the dreadful knowledge he'd brought with him when he appeared in a murderous snowstorm outside Fingal's gates. That book, they spoke of it at Naglamund. Yarnaga said it supposedly tells of the Storm King's coming and other things. He says, and then Kadrak says, by the time I'd finished reading it, I was no longer a scroll bearer. I knew in my heart, from the moment I turned the last page, I gave up the love of learning for the love of oblivion. The two cannot live together. And, it's a book that essentially is giving them hope, but it turns out that bringing the three swords together, swords that were made by, made out of things that weren't of Osten-Ard, and also were reforged by the creatures, the Draros, the Niskis, and by Inaluki himself when it comes to sorrow. They made these swords into, we could call them magical items. And so I'm going to read you a particular important passage talking about them. So the false messenger part, here we go. We don't want to spend all that much time going over this. There's an entire chapter called the false messenger. And we learn Binabik is the one who figures it out. He says, why is Thorn being brought here? Why are Joshua and others searching for Bright Nail? To use against the Storm King, Miramele replied. She did not see where the troll's questions were leading, but Kadrak evidently did. A grim half-smile curled the monk's lips. But why, asked the troll, what was telling us to use them against our enemy? This is not something for tricking you, Miramele. It is what I myself have been worrying until my head feels full of sharp stones, because of the rhyme. And so they talk about this rhyme. When nightmare throttles peaceful sleep, three swords must come again. If early shall resist too late, three swords must come again. I've heard it 100 times, she snapped. Anger only thinly covered her fear at the little man's strange expression. What are you saying? Binabik lifted his hands. Listen to what it is telling, Miramele. All the first parts are true. Diggers, giants, the great bell and Naban. But in the end, it only speaks of turning fate, of clearing time and early fighting against late. What then is to say that it speaks to us? Do you mean to say that it could just as easily be speaking of what will be helping the Storm King himself? For what are we mortals being to him if not the lateness to his earliness? Who is turning this fate and whose fate is it being? And so we find that when the swords are actually brought together, they are creating this opportunity for the Storm King to be brought back into being as no longer a dream, as no longer a thing out there in the, unbeing, but as a real thing. But we also find, and this is a very important resolution to it, that Simon is going to figure out how to deal with this. And a certain kind of goodness is actually going to overcome the evil that is being brought into the world. So here's the passage. In this moment of horror, Simon suddenly felt the shock of the dragon blood that had once scorched his flesh and changed him. He stared at the unsteady black shape that had been Elias, the ruined husk and its fiery occupant, and felt an answering stab of pain where the dragon's black essence had scarred him. Through the pulsing unlight that moved between bright nail and sorrow, Simon felt not only the all-consuming hatred that had been the blood of the Storm King's deathly exile, but also Inaluki's terrible, mad loneliness. He loved his people, Simon thought. He gave his life for them, but did not die. Staring helplessly across the short distance between them, watching as the thing regathered its strength, Simon remembered the vision Lilith had shown him of Inaluki beside the great pool. Such shattering unhappiness had been in the face, but the determination had been a mirror of Aelstan's as he sat in his chair and waited for the terrible worm he knew he must meet, the dragon he knew he would slay him. They were somehow the same, Inaluki and Aelstan, doing what must be done, though life itself was the price. So Simon is able to have a sort of, not just hatred, not just that is the other, I must, be angry, I must fight against them, but a kind of compassion for them. Simon was no different. Sorrow, his thoughts flittered and died like moths in a flame, but he clung to this one. Inaluki named his sword Sorrow. Why did she show me that? Hatred kept him alive in the dark places. 5 centuries burning in emptiness. Hatred is all he has. And I have hated too. I have felt like him. We are the same. Simon struggled to keep the image of the living Inaluki's suffering face before him. That was the truth beneath this horrible burning thing. No creature in all the cosmos deserved what had happened to the Storm King. I'm sorry, he whispered to the face in his memory. You should not have suffered so. The surge of energy from Bright Nail suddenly grew less. The thing that held sorrow turned back to him, and waves of terror broke over Simon again. His heart was being crushed. No, he gasped and groped around inside of himself for a solid place to stand and live. I will fear you, but I will not hate you. There came a still instant that seemed like years. Then Sir Camaris rose slowly from his knees and stood swaying. In his hands, thorns still throbbed with blackness, but Simon felt the drain of its forces weaken, as though what he himself felt had somehow run down the point of connection into Camaris as well. Forgiven, the old knight croaked, yes, let all be. There was a wavering at the center of the darkness that was the Storm King. For a moment the scarlet light grew less, then died. A glowing red haze leaked free, agitated as a swarm of bees. In the center of the shadows, wreathed in smoke, the pale visage of King Elias shimmered into existence, his face contorted in pain. Wisps of smoke curled from his hair, flames darted on his cape and shirt. The king turned his eyes to his daughter. Ah, God, Miramela, he has waited too long for this. He will not let me go. I was a fool, and now I am repaid. I am sorry, daughter. He is too strong. His hate is too strong. He will not let me go. Miramela fires an arrow at him, and the clawing thing fell away, shrieking soundlessly. And that is essentially the climax of this. It's not just that, love and, ooey gooey goodness overcomes the evil. No, it requires getting past the hatred, the anger, the disgust that you easily feel, and feeling compassion, a compassion that can extend then to Camaris and to Elias, the other 2 sword holders. And that is what allows the vulnerability for Miramela to draw her arrow and shoot her own father, in whose body is the Storm King. And that is not the end of the story, but it's a fitting place to end this little examination of it. There's, quite a few pages afterwards that are, bringing everything together, the love story between Simon and Miramela, they becoming the new king and queen, Rachel the dragon being brought in to set things right, and Joshua not dying, but going off to live his life no longer beset with the burdens of rulership. And that is where that portion of this massive trilogy depicting the developments and grand sweep of the plot in Ost and Ard ends at least until the second set of books, and that is where we will end here.